The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, whipping dust and dead leaves into the air. The sky, once a soft amber, darkened with the threat of an oncoming storm. A single rider urged her horse forward, breath coming in sharp gasps. Eleanor Reed gripped the reins with trembling hands, her heart pounding in time with the rapid beat of hooves against hard-packed earth. She dared not look back. She could still hear them. Somewhere in the distance, the shouts of outlaws echoed off the canyon walls. She had seen their faces in the glow of the dying sun, their grins stained with cruelty, their voices thick with the promise of something worse than death. Alone, unarmed, and lost, Eleanor had little choice but to run. The path ahead was treacherous. The canyon narrowed, walls closing like the jaws of a great beast. Her horse stumbled on loose rock, nearly throwing her from the saddle. She gasped, tightening her grip, but the jolt sent a sharp pain through her ankle. She must have twisted it in the frantic escape. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon for a brief moment. Then came the thunder, rolling in like the war drums of an unseen enemy. The air thickened, heavy with impending rain. She pulled on the reins, forcing her mount to slow. If she rode blindly into the storm, she would break her neck before the outlaws even had a chance. A rustling in the brush to her left. Her breath hitched. She reached for the small knife she kept at her belt, though she knew it would do little against a bullet or a cruel hand. The night pressed in, suffocating in its silence. The storm held its breath. Then a shadow emerged from the rock face, tall, unmoving, eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting the flickering lightning. Eleanor's grip tightened on the knife, her fingers white. She had heard the stories. Apache, silent as the wind, deadly as a snake. He stood just beyond reach, wrapped in a cloak of night, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. She wanted to speak, to demand who he was, but her throat tightened, fear pressing against her ribs. He said nothing, made no move toward her. Only the faintest shift of his weight betrayed his presence as real. Another shout in the distance. Closer. The outlaws were coming. She turned sharply, trying to decide, run and risk him attacking from behind, or stay and face both dangers at once. But the moment broke when he lifted his hand, slow and deliberate, not in threat, not in surrender. A warning. A branch snapped, this time behind her. Eleanor barely had time to turn before a rough hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her from the saddle. The knife fell from her grasp, lost in the dust. She thrashed, but her captor was too strong, his arm locking around her waist. Well, the man rasped, breath hot against her ear. Look what we got here. Another figure emerged from the darkness. A second outlaw, gun drawn, smirking. I told you she'd come this way, he sneered. Eleanor's heart hammered. She fought, kicking wildly, but the first man only laughed, adjusting his grip. Fiery little thing, ain't she? A sharp whistle cut through the air. It happened fast. A blur of movement. The outlaw holding Eleanor jerked, choking on his own breath. A wet sound, then a sudden slackening of his grip. He collapsed, an arrow buried deep in his throat. The second man spun, raising his gun, but the Apache warrior was already upon him. A flash of steel. The gunshot rang out, wild, misaimed, lost in the storm. The blade found its mark. Silence. Eleanor stood frozen, her breath ragged. The outlaw's body slumped to the ground, lifeless. The storm rumbled in the distance, creeping closer. The air smelled of rain and blood. She turned sharply, eyes locking onto her unexpected savior. He had moved with such lethal grace, like a spirit of the land itself. Now, standing over the dead, he looked at her again, measuring, deciding. She backed away, stumbling. He made no move to stop her. She could run. She should. But the canyon was still dangerous, and she was alone. Her horse had bolted in the scuffle, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nightfall looming and a storm on its heels. The warrior studied her a moment longer, then turned without a word, moving toward the trees that lined the canyon's edge. It took her a second to realize. He was leaving. He had saved her. And now, he was simply walking away. Wait! She rasped before she could stop herself. He paused. She swallowed, Her voice was weak, barely audible. She hesitated. She didn't know what she wanted to say. Thank you? Why did you save me? Who are you? He did not answer. Instead, he gestured, a simple nod toward the trees. A direction, a choice. Stay and die in the storm, or follow him into the unknown. She hesitated for only a moment before limping after him. The storm had broken over the land, unleashing a torrential downpour that swallowed the canyon in darkness. Rain hammered against the earth, turning the dry soil into slick mud, and the wind shrieked through the twisted branches of mesquite and juniper. Eleanor staggered, her injured ankle screaming in protest with every uneven step. Ahead of her, the Apache warrior moved like a shadow, unbothered by the elements, his steps sure and silent. She had no choice but to follow. Lightning slashed the sky, illuminating the path for a brief, blinding second. The trail was treacherous, winding through jagged rocks and overgrown brush. Eleanor fought against the ache in her limbs, the sting of cuts on her hands where she had braced against thorns. Still, she kept moving, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her soaked dress clinging to her skin. The warrior said nothing, never once looking back to see if she still followed. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. What if he meant to lead her into the wilderness and leave her to die? What if saving her from the outlaws had been nothing more than a fleeting impulse? She had no reason to trust him. His people were the enemy. At least, that's what she had always been told. But then, as if sensing her hesitation, he suddenly stopped. She nearly stumbled into him, catching herself just in time. He gestured to a cluster of rocks overhanging a small recess in the canyon wall. It wasn't much, barely enough to keep them dry. But it was shelter. He disappeared beneath it, crouching near a pile of dry wood that had been stored there, hidden from the storm. A shiver ran through Eleanor, the cold biting into her bones. She hesitated, casting a wary glance at the darkness beyond. If she turned and ran, where would she go? The storm was growing stronger, the night stretching endlessly in every direction. Taking a slow, measured breath, she stepped under the outcrop, careful to keep her distance from him. The warrior worked in silence, striking flint against steel until sparks danced onto the wood. Within moments, a fire crackled to life, its flickering glow casting long shadows against the stone. The warmth was immediate, a relief against the chill that had seeped into her skin. Eleanor hugged her arms around herself, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. He sat cross-legged, tending the fire with practiced ease, his face impassive, unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the relentless patter of rain and the occasional crackle of burning wood. Finally, she found her voice, though it was hoarse from exhaustion. "Why did you save me?" He didn't answer right away. He continued to stir the fire, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and quiet, rough like wind over stone. 2 men against 1 woman. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, unblinking. No honor in that. His English was clear, but there was a weight to his words, an accent shaped by a language far older than her own. She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The idea of an outlaw having honor was laughable. She had seen enough to know that men who lurked in the wilderness, preying on travelers, had none. But what about him? Eleanor pulled her knees to her chest, her wet clothes offering little comfort. The fire's glow softened the hard lines of the warrior's face, revealing something she hadn't noticed before. The weariness in his eyes, the faded scar running along his temple, the quiet stillness of a man who had seen too much. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. Not as sharp, not as cold. She had questions, so many questions, but fear kept them locked behind her lips. Instead, she watched as he reached into a small leather pouch in his belt and pulled free a bundle of dried meat. Without a word, he tore a piece and held out to her. Eleanor hesitated. Trust was not something given freely. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "They are savages, girl. They'll cut your throat soon as look at you." But her father had also been a hard man, a man who had burned Apache camps and called it justice, a man who had told her never to look them in the eye, because it meant they would steal your soul. And yet, Here she was, staring into the firelit gaze of a man who would save her life. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and took the offering. The warrior said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, something almost imperceptible. She chewed in silence, her stomach grateful for anything after the day's ordeal. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Minutes passed, the fire burning low. Her body ached, exhaustion settling into her bones, dragging at her eyelids. She fought it for as long as she could, but sleep was inevitable. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a warrior, still sitting by the fire, his gaze turned toward the entrance of the shelter, watching the night. Dawn came slow and gray, the storm having finally spent its fury. Eleanor stirred, groggy and disoriented. The fire was nothing but embers now, a soft red glow beneath a pile of ash. For a brief, disorienting moment, she forgot where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The outlaws, the canyon, the warrior. She sat up too fast, and a sharp pain lanced through her ankle. She hissed, gripping her leg. A movement caught her attention. He was crouched near the entrance, sharpening a knife against a whetstone. His gaze flicked to her briefly before returning to his task. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "I need to get back," she murmured, her voice hoarse. The warrior didn't stop sharpening the blade. Back where? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Back home? Back to the settlement, where her father would demand to know why she had been alone in the wilderness? Where he would call her reckless, or worse, impure, for having spent a night with an Apache. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her chest. The warrior watched her carefully, as if reading the turmoil on her face. After a long moment, he set the knife down and stood. "I will take you," he said simply. Something in her gut twisted. He was offering to lead her back, to let her go. But something had shifted in the night, something she couldn't quite name. She should feel relieved. Instead, all she felt was uncertainty. Still, she nodded, pulling herself up with difficulty. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Her journey with the warrior was not yet over. The morning air carried a chill, the remnant of last night's storm lingering in the damp scent of wet earth and pine. Eleanor walked with careful steps, her ankles still tender, but she refused to show weakness. The Apache warrior, Chayton. She had heard his name once when the outlaws had spoken of him in fear, move ahead of her. Silent as ever, he had said little since they had left the shelter of the canyon, guiding her through the vast wilderness with the same precision he had shown the night before. They traveled in uneasy quiet, only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a hawk breaking the stillness. Eleanor had tried to shake the thoughts gnawing at her mind, the questions that had settled like stones in her chest. How would she explain where she had been? What would her father say when she returned, escorted by a man he would see as nothing more than a savage? The thought tightened around her ribs like a noose. The land began to change as they descended from the rocky terrain into rolling grasslands, the familiar landscape of settler country. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, a strange unease settled in Eleanor's stomach. She was close now, close to home, to safety, but was it truly safety? The memory of her father's sharp, commanding voice echoed in her mind, his lessons about the Apache clear and unwavering. They were to be feared, to be hunted like wild animals. No exceptions. Chayton halted suddenly. Eleanor nearly walked into him before she noticed his stance, rigid, alert. His gaze flicked toward the horizon, and when she followed his line of sight, her breath caught. A group of riders was approaching. Dust rose in plumes behind them, their silhouettes stark against the brightening sky. She recognized the uniforms, even from a distance, U.S. cavalry. And at the front of the group, her father. Panic seized her. She turned to Chayton, but he had already stepped back, his muscles tensed, his fingers hovering near the hilt of the blade at his waist. "They are looking for you," he said quietly. Eleanor swallowed, her pulse thrumming wildly in her throat. She should feel relieved. Her father had come for her. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? The riders closed the distance, their faces becoming clear. Her father, Colonel Reed, sat tall in the saddle, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, scanning the scene before him. The moment he saw her standing beside Chayton, his face darkened. "Eleanor!" His voice was sharp, edged with disbelief and something else. Anger. Eleanor took an unsteady step forward. "Father, I—" Get away from him. The order cut through the air like the crack of a whip. She flinched. "No, listen." "I said step away." His hand went to his revolver, the metal gleaming in the morning light. Chayton didn't move. He stood still, unreadable, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating off him. The other soldiers had already drawn their weapons, their eyes flicking between Chayton and their commanding officer, waiting for the order. "This man saved my life," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she expected. Colonel Reed's eyes narrowed. "He is Apache. That tells me everything I need to know." Eleanor's chest tightened. "You don't understand." "I understand plenty." His gaze locked onto Chayton with the cold certainty of a man who had made up his mind long before this moment. "He took you, didn't he? Held you captive?" "No." The word came out too fast, too desperate. "It wasn't like that." Colonel Reed wasn't listening. "Step away from him now, Eleanor. That is an order." Chayton still hadn't spoken. His breathing was calm, his hand steady. But Eleanor could sense it, the weight of a man who had been through this before, who had stood at the wrong end of the gun too many times, who knew exactly how this would end if she obeyed. She turned to him, her voice low. "You have to leave." "I do not run," he said simply. The statement shook something deep inside her. Of course he didn't. Running had never been an option for him. Not in a world where men like her father saw him as little more than an enemy, a ghost of a war long since lost. "Then fight," she whispered. "But not like this. Not now." Chayton held her gaze for a long, weighted moment. Then, slowly, he took a step back, his hand still open, still unthreatening. But the motion was misread. One of the soldiers, young and jumpy, took it as a sign of aggression. The gunshot rang out like a crack of thunder. Eleanor didn't think. She acted. She threw herself between them, shoving Chayton out of the way. Pain seared through her upper arm, white-hot and blinding. She hit the ground hard, gasping. Chaos erupted. Chayton moved like lightning, a blur of motion as he reached the knife at his waist. The soldiers fumbled, caught between confusion and action, their guns raised but hesitating, the sight of Eleanor bleeding halting them. "Hold your fire," someone shouted, but the damage was done. Chayton's eyes were on her, not the men. His brow furrowed as he crouched beside her, pressing his hand to her wound. She gritted her teeth, breathing hard, the pain radiating through her shoulder. "Eleanor!" Her father was dismounting, his expression twisted in fury. "What in God's name are you doing?" She blinked up at him, struggling for breath. "They shot me." His jaw clenched, but instead of answering her, he turned his glare on Chayton. "Get your hands off her." Chayton didn't move. His hand remained firm against her wound, stopping the bleeding, his expression as unreadable as ever. Eleanor grabbed his wrist, a silent message. He met her gaze, understanding flashing in the depths of his dark eyes. If he let her go now, if he surrendered, they would kill him, and she wouldn't let that happen. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she turned her head to her father. "I won't let you hurt him." The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Reed's expression twisted with something unreadable. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she whispered, her voice raw. More than ever. His fingers flexed around the handle of his revolver. The storm had passed, but another one was brewing in his stance, in his breath, in the way his men waited for the next command. For a long, excruciating moment, he just looked at her. Then, with a slow, reluctant movement, he stepped back. The revolver remained in its holster, but the fire in his eyes burned just as fiercely. "You are no daughter of mine." Eleanor felt the words like a blow, but she did not flinch. Her father turned sharply on his heel, signaling to his men. "Let them go." Confusion flickered among the soldiers, but none questioned the order. One by one, they lowered their weapons, and just like that, the battle that could have been never came to pass. Chayton stood slowly, watching as the cavalry mounted their horses and rode away, disappearing into the golden light of morning. Eleanor sat there in the grass, her breath unsteady, her arm throbbing. The world had shifted beneath her feet. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. The world had shifted. The line that once divided Eleanor's life, the boundary between who she was and who she had become, had been shattered in the morning light. She was no longer the daughter of Colonel Reed. She was no longer bound to rules of the settler world, the safety of a home that had never truly felt like her own. And as she sat there, her arm burning, her breath coming in uneven gasps, she understood with an aching certainty that there was no turning back. Chayton stood beside her, silent as ever, but there was something in his expression that had not been there before. A quiet understanding, a question left unspoken. Would she follow him? She forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly. Her father and his men had disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the vastness of the land, but their presence still lingered in the air like the last echoes of a storm. Chayton's gaze swept over her, lingering briefly on the blood, seeping through her sleeve before flicking back to her face. "You are sure?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "I am." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once. There were no more words needed. They moved quickly, slipping into the wilderness before her father could have second thoughts. The vast expanse of the land stretched before them. Rolling hills, dense forests, winding rivers cutting through the earth like veins. Chayton knew the way. He led her through hidden trails, across narrow passes where the land dropped away into sheer cliffs, through thick groves where the branches reached like fingers toward the sky. The journey was grueling, each step a test of endurance, but Eleanor kept moving, her body driven by something deeper than pain. Days passed in silence, the air thick with the scent of pine and rain-dampened earth. The further they traveled, the more Eleanor began to feel the weight of her decisions settling over her. She was walking away from everything she had ever known, leaving behind a world that had raised her but never truly accepted her. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it steadied her. On the third day, they crossed into Apache land. The moment they entered the territory, Chayton changed. His shoulders straightened, his steps grew more certain. But there was also a tension in him, a quiet wariness that had not been there before. Eleanor felt it too. This was his home, his people, but she was still an outsider. As they neared the village, the first signs of life emerged from the trees. Children playing near the water's edge, their laughter echoing through the valley. Women worked near the lodges, their hands busy weaving, grinding maize, tending to the fires. The moment they saw Chayton, movement stilled. Conversations halted, eyes turned, and then they saw her. A murmur rippled through the village, voices hushed and uncertain. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her, like 1,000 unspoken questions. Chayton did not slow. He moved with purpose, guiding her toward the largest lodge in the center of the village. An elder stood waiting. The man was aged but strong, his face marked with the wisdom of years, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. He studied Eleanor for a long, assessing moment before shifting his focus to Chayton. "You bring a settler into our home?" His voice carried no emotion, only quiet curiosity. Chayton met his gaze without hesitation. "She is not like the others." The elder's eyes flicked back to Eleanor, "and yet she is one of them." Eleanor forced herself to stand tall, despite the ache in her limbs. "I left them." The elder tilted his head slightly, considering her. "A woman does not leave her people so easily." She swallowed. "They are not my people." A beat of silence. Then the elder's gaze softened, just a fraction. "We shall see." That night, Eleanor sat by the fire, feeling the cautious stares from those who passed. She was not yet welcome here. That much was clear, but she had not been turned away either. That, she supposed, was something. Chayton sat beside her, silent as ever. He had not spoken much since they arrived, but she felt his presence like a steadying force. Finally, he broke the silence. "They will not trust you easily." "I don't expect them to," she admitted. He nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected. "You will have to prove yourself." She turned to him then, searching his face. "And you?" Do you trust me? His gaze held hers, deep and unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he said, "You're still here." And somehow that was enough. But peace was not meant to last. The attack came just before dawn. The first sign was the distant thunder of hooves. Eleanor woke to the sound, disoriented, her body tensing instinctively. Chayton was already up, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the fire. The village stirred, shadows moving swiftly, voices murmuring in urgent whispers. Then, the first gunshot cracked through the air. Chaos erupted. Eleanor stumbled to her feet as shouts filled the village. The unmistakable clash of steel against steel, the whistle of arrows slicing through the darkness. Fires were kicked over, sending embers flying into the air like dying stars. Settlers. She saw the gleam of their rifles, the flash of familiar uniforms. Cavalry. Her father's men. Her stomach lurched. Chayton grabbed her wrist, pulling her behind him as he moved with deadly precision. The battle unfolded around them, warriors emerging from the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency, meeting the soldiers in fierce combat. Eleanor's pulse thundered. She caught glimpses of faces she recognized, men who had once greeted her father with respect, who had sat in her home and spoken of duty and honor. And now they were here, burning, destroying, killing. For a brief, gut-wrenching moment, she thought she saw her father. Then a soldier turned toward her, rifle raised. Instinct took over. She moved before she could think, her fingers wrapping around the hilt of a fallen warrior's knife. The man lunged. She ducked, twisting sharply, the blade slicing through fabric and flesh. The soldier grunted, stumbling, his rifle clattering to the ground. She had drawn blood. The realization struck her like a blow, but there was no time to process it. Chayton pulled her back just as another shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dirt at their feet. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. The village was burning. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. This was no battle. It was a slaughter. They ran. Through the trees, the world a blur of fire and shadow. Eleanor's legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. The sound of pursuit echoed behind them. Men shouting, hooves pounding against the earth. Then suddenly, the ground dropped away. A cliff. Eleanor skidded to a halt, breath heaving, heart hammering against her ribs. The river rushed below, dark and wild. Chayton turned, his knife raised as the first of the soldiers burst through the trees. There was no choice. Eleanor met Chayton's gaze. And then, without a word, they jumped. The cold was a shock, the river pulling them under, its current wrapping around them like a living thing. She fought against it, her limbs burning, her lungs screaming for air. And then hands. Strong hands pulling her up. She broke the surface, gasping, coughing. Chayton was beside her, gripping her wrist, his face unreadable. They floated, carried by the river. The battle left behind in the burning remains of the village. When they finally crawled onto the riverbank, Eleanor collapsed onto the earth, her body trembling. The world was silent but for the distant crackle of fire, the slow breath of the wind through the trees. Chayton sat beside her, his gaze turned to the horizon. They had survived. But at what cost? Eleanor closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. She had lost everything. And yet, as she lay there, drenched and exhausted, she realized one thing with aching certainty. She did not regret it.